The information economy has arrived. The world is teeming with innovation as new business models reinvent every industry. InsideAnalysis is your source of information and insight about how to make the most of this exciting new era. Learn more at InsideAnalysis.com.
InsideAnalysis.com.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the only coast-to-coast radio show in the US of A, all about the information economy. It's time for Inside Analysis. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here, and this is part of our series called the CX Experience. We're talking all about customer experience, the technologies, the tools, the methodologies that come into play to make that better. And if you're wondering consumer experience, customer experience, what does that really mean? Well, it means your experience with any organization as a consumer, as a customer, whether it's on the phone, whether it's in person, whether it's via email or a text message, however it is that you interact with any number of big brands or even small upstarts, quite frankly, that experience itself will determine whether or not you stay with that particular provider, whether or not you go and look at something else perhaps. And customer experience is very tightly associated with brand, right? So you hear people talking about being on brand, for example. Brands take a long time to build up, or they certainly can. And people want, of course, trust to be associated with their brand. They want good service to be associated with their brand. There's a certain style around it. I think of Southwest Airlines, for example. Years ago, I actually met the guy. I went to an event in Austin, Texas, and I met the guy who was their, I guess, chief marketing officer. And he started the whole thing around them being very playful and fun. You're now free to move about the country, all the sort of joking that the pilots will do and the people, the stewardesses and so forth. That all came from one guy who had this big idea to brand the company in that fashion. So they want all their customer experiences to really align with that brand. And today we're going to talk with a couple of experts, Tom Taulli and also Ian Beaver, about customer experience and really how artificial intelligence intersects with customer experience. And so with that, let me bring in our first guest, Tom Taulli, author. He's been just put up a big class on Pluralsight, I believe, around customer experience or consumer experience. Tom, tell us a bit about yourself, what you're working on, and how you see the intersection of AI and CX really reshaping business and how we do business.
And thanks very much for having me on. In terms of my background, I can unfortunately go on forever and ever because I'm old. But I started as a developer and founded some companies, but along the way I've done a lot of writing for publications like Forbes.com and so forth. And then about 3 years ago, I wrote a book called Artificial Intelligence Basics, and wrote another book on artificial intelligence. So I've been really immersed in that, more from a writing perspective, and sometimes I advise some companies here and there on the topic. In terms of what I see with artificial intelligence and CX or the customer experience is, I look at, for businesses, I look at AI and more in two categories, I would say. And there's kind of the AI for research purposes or insight purposes. So it's kind of behind the scenes, your customers don't see it. So, it could be about, let's analyze the churn rate and let's figure out why the churn rate is going up. Can we figure out by using some machine learning or some algorithms in this data, why is it going up, and maybe we can find ways to reduce it. So that's something that's really not, it's not interacting with the customer. But when you're doing customer experience, that's high stakes,
right?
Because if you get it wrong, then your customer is going to probably tell you about it. You may lose a customer because you get it wrong. And even though there's been so many advances in AI, we're not at the level of free-flowing conversation, breaking the Turing test, and we're not at the Hollywood stage where we can't even tell the difference of who we're interacting with is human or a computer,
right?
And so there's risk. So if you go down the road of using this technology for CX, you need to do your homework, and you probably need to do other things before that to build your AI muscles. This is more of the big leagues, I would say, when it comes to using this technology.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Building your AI muscles, like getting your sea legs underneath you, basically. You definitely want to play around with this technology, obviously research it first, and then target some particular process. We're going to talk about chatbots, I think, a fair amount today, or at least a little bit. And people know what a chatbot is. They're all over the place. I have a theory, actually, that chatbots came to the fore largely because search failed. If you think about search, I'm talking intra-site search, like not Google. In fact, a lot of times what you do when the search on a website failed is you just go to Google and search there and get a better response than you did using the old search engine on the site you're using. And that's because search really is kind of hard. It's hard to optimize. Google has mastered that. But now we have all these bots. Hey, can I help you? What are you looking for? They're throwing questions at you. They're trying to interact with you and get you to channel your attention through them. And if you do that well, it can be a wonderful source of information about what your audience members want, what your customers want, what concerns do they have. And then and you've written a lot about this, I believe. You want to sort of incrementally build out the lexicon of your bot, what it talks about, what kinds of instructions it gives, and then manage that over time, right?
Yeah, and there are no shortage of bots on the market, or chatbot systems, to free ones, open source, expensive ones that don't work. Every type of chatbot you can imagine exists out there. And some are really not AI at all. I mean, probably a lot of them are not AI. It's just more rules-based.
Right.
So it'll ask typical questions, and then, you map it with certain responses back to the user. So what are the hours of the company? Oh, that's an easy one. Stuff like that. Again, the high stakes would be using the AI for that. And I just recently, so on Amazon, obviously they're really good at this stuff. So I had a product that just didn't show up, and Amazon said, probably didn't show up because it got lost. You need to get a refund or whatever. So a return. And I thought, usually I just hate to go through that process. It's just such a waste of time. And if it's like a low price item, I'll just say, forget it, but it was actually a higher price item. And I thought, maybe I should. So I tried out the chatbot, and I could tell it wasn't a human, because the responses were almost instantaneous.
Wow.
And I try to mess around with it, and it worked. I mean, it figured it out. Within less than a minute, it resolved my issue.
No kidding.
And I was really impressed by the whole situation, by the whole thing. I thought, that's how you do it. But you're not going to get that buying a system and getting that out of the box.
Right.
You're going to need people to train it. You're going to probably need some data scientists. It needs to understand your particular market and your products. So to get that level takes a long time. But there are chatbots really out of the box that can do some basic things and really save some time and lower your costs.
Yeah, that's a bunch of really good advice you just threw out there. And it's a great story, because these things really can work. And then I think the key is to regularly track and monitor how well it's working. Are your scores going up, your net promoter scores? Are your customer complaints coming down? Where are the edges, really? And that's kind of what you're trying to do, is identify opportunities where a quick answer will solve the problem, solve the customer service issue, whether it's address, phone number, that kind of stuff, such that your people can focus on the more complex issues, such as high-value customers calling in for the third time because their products aren't showing up on time or something. It's all about optimizing what people work on in your company, right, Tom?
Exactly. And, you look at a company like Amazon, and I've never called Amazon. No, I don't think I've ever talked. I've used Amazon for over 20 years. And I've never talked to a person at Amazon, and I can't imagine. I can't imagine how much I've spent on Amazon.
Wow.
So that's the high bar. But the good news is that this technology is getting more affordable. It's getting more accessible. And so if as a company, if you want to be competitive, you really have to do this. And the other thing too is customers just, we're getting spoiled from Amazon and Uber and these great companies. And customers just expect that you're going to have this. And if you don't, they're just say, well, who wants to deal with this company anymore? Right. They don't have the kinds of things, I want to interact with my messenger with this company. They won't let me. Well, that could be a deal killer nowadays.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's rapidly moving in that direction. These bigger companies are pushing it that way, and companies, I don't think this is something that companies should look at as, a nice experiment or to think about the long term. It's probably something they need to do today.
Yeah, that's a good point. And let me use that as a segue to bring in Ian Beaver from Verint. What are your thoughts on that, Ian? I think Tom is right that this is going to become more and more of a must-have as opposed to a nice-to-have in business. And I guess the key there is the time windows are collapsing, I think. So the time window of when you notice there's a problem in the marketplace that you have to address with your product or solution, and the time you actually address that solution, it used to be months, then it's kind of weeks. Now it's weeks or less, it seems to me. What do you think about the trajectory of where AI is going and the necessity of companies using it?
Yeah, no, it's a very important point that as data becomes more real time in a sense, we now have all of this interaction data coming streaming. I mean, it used to be there was sort of batch processing that happened behind the scenes where,
right,
you might run some reports and weekly those reports get distributed to people that care, and then they go through the stuff and they try to figure out ways to influence change. But now you could, real-time reports, like what's happening right this second across your contact center, like what agents are struggling right now with a contact because maybe they don't have the information they need or they can't find it in their knowledge base or something like that. You can have all this stuff sort of like at a contact center supervisor's fingertips. And this is all very sort of new. The other thing too is just the fact that as AI systems are built and deployed, and they really are, in a sense, a virtual employee, you have to make sure that they are representing your company well and that they continue to do so. So this is kind of an interesting thing that we ran into several years ago when Google released the Google Pixel phone. Previous to that, a pixel was just like a measurement of resolution on a computer monitor, right, or a television. And so like in all the lexicons of all the models that we used, a pixel had a certain meaning. But then as soon as that came out and everybody started talking about Google Pixel, all of a sudden that context changed and that word has a new definition. And you have to go back and sort of retrain all these models that when you hear pixel in context with Google or phone or something like that, it means something entirely different than anything you ever thought before.
Right.
And so as competitors are releasing new products and your products are changing and the market's changing, all these models have to be sort of monitored and kept up to date and make sure that the customer experience isn't being impacted by maybe something that's completely out of your control, like a competitor's product.
That's a really good point. And I'm glad that you mentioned this aspect about these bots being like employees. So the bots, there was this great story of Tay, the Microsoft AI-driven bot that they launched a few years ago that went sideways very quickly because they didn't test it enough. They didn't make sure that it was going to do what they wanted it to do. And they had to take it down because it started spitting out, unpleasant things. And you sure don't want that. But so to your point, it is like another employee, and you really have to think through how it's responding, how it acts, the things that it says, and check that very carefully. Because to Tom's point earlier, if you don't, you could really upset someone pretty quickly. And when it's automated, you don't want to be upsetting people in an automatic way, right, Ian?
Yeah, and so one of the things that we have to always sort of keep in mind as we're building and deploying these virtual assistants on behalf of other companies and organizations is giving them the tools to monitor these things quickly. And so we've built we, in a sense, use AI to validate the AI is working appropriately. So we have built a bunch of analysis tools and platforms that we can provide to help them monitor how well these things are doing in the wild. And so one of the ways that we do that is we look at what are sort of detectable features of failure or miscommunication that can be watched for. And so as these conversations are ongoing with contact center agents and customers, can we detect if there's issues happening sort of real time between the two humans, or when we have a virtual assistant out there in the wild and it's having conversations with customers, what's sort of different about those kinds of conversations, and what kind of features relate to virtual assistants that we need to watch for versus the working to customer agents and that we need to watch for. And so the things, there's a lot of things that we can actually sort of automate. One of those things is, there's a lot of ways that people communicate that can be sort of automatically measured. Like, are you interrupting the customer frequently? Right. Are you spending them too much time, putting them on hold? Are you talking too fast so they can't understand you? These sorts of things can actually be measured automatically. And so we can provide these sort of scores, in a sense, that we can give back to supervisors or even directly to contact center agents and say, hey, you know what, you're talking a little fast, just slow down a little bit. And that feedback can be almost immediate and can help sort of provide better customer experience and better things. And on the same side, on the virtual assistant side, we can do things like if we notice things where, say, customers are rephrasing their question a lot of times that demonstrates they're fishing for a better answer than they're getting. And so we can do things like, try to detect those sorts of features and look for ways that the bot can be improved very quickly, as opposed to, waiting till people sort of hang up or quit the conversation or escalate the conversation to a human to let us know something went wrong.
Right. Yeah, that's a fantastic point too. And to your earlier point, I think it's very important for someone to be managing this process. So watching how the bot responds. But one thing that kind of struck me as you were talking is that humans can learn from the machines. We want the machines to learn from us. Obviously, we're trying to train them manually. We think we know what we can tell them and how we can help them. But there's something to be said too for paying attention to what the machines do. I mean, Tom had that great story about how this bot solved his problem, and he was even being a bit cagey with it. So that's a great sign. I think that, as humans, we should be open-minded about what the machines can learn and recommend about us. And this, I think, is the real direction of AI going forward. We could pick this up after the break coming up here, but is learning from suggestions that the AI engines give us. We don't necessarily have to take the suggestions, but just learning from what they suggest. Mention this new product, mention this new service, talk about this research study, for example. Could be real-time prompts for the customer service agent on the phone to really help them do their job best. But don't touch that dial, folks. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
Take us to the future.
All right, folks, take us to the future indeed. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh, here on Inside Analysis, talking to Tom Taulli, author and evangelist, and also Ian Beaver from a company called Verint. And he's an expert in AI as well. And Tom, you wrote the book on this stuff, Artificial Intelligence Basics, a non-technical introduction. Folks, you can find that out there on Amazon. And it's good to sort of apprise yourself of what is out there as a business person. I mean, if you have any front-facing, any customer-facing application, you should start looking into these, because you don't have to even buy the algorithms. You can just rent this stuff. A lot of them are freely available. The question is, who's going to pay for the compute and the execution? But it's all over the place, right, Tom?
Yeah, algorithms are the easy part. Mm-hmm. They've come through academia. And they've been open source. Academia is usually not the type of culture that's out there to monetize things. They'll put it in a research paper, and it's there for everybody to use. So the algorithms are really not the differentiator. Now, for something like a company like Facebook, they will create some of their own proprietary algorithms. But even these companies, even the big companies, are open sourcing a lot of their research. So the differentiator really is to the data. So again, if you're Facebook and you're sitting on huge amounts of data, you're in a good position to leverage AI. But if I'm a tiny business and I don't have a lot of data, those algorithms are not going to help you a lot. So you with a chatbot, you you could take advantage of, pooling this data from other sources, and get benefits from that. Or you could go to Amazon. You can, like you said, rent their AI and their chatbots, and take advantage of their data. So that's kind of how it works. And I think it's good. But the fun stuff is always the algorithms. But,
right. That is the fun stuff. And let me throw it over to Ian, because you had a really good point in the break about how to ensure success with these technologies. And it really comes down to defining desired outcomes. What do I want to be the case? You could keep it simple and say, I want to promote or increase our net promoter score, for example, or customer experience. But you could have very specific things you want to achieve, and then you have to define what those are, and then look for, as we say in the risk management world, the control points, right? That chatbot is a control point. And as it's talking to your customers on your website, for example, that's an opportunity to bring in all sorts of information to kind of sense. And if you know something about this person, it's a high value client, that's even more powerful if you can identify that and then make sure you're dedicating enough resources on the back end to really pay attention to this customer. How much of that do you see, Ian, of companies really understanding, segmenting their customers into groups, and then making sure that they're sort of modifying what they do based upon who they are and what group they're in?
Yeah, there's certainly the potential for that. A lot of times, when people call in and you go through the sort of the verification phase of this is who I'm actually talking to and things, on the agent desktop, we can pull up all the prior interaction histories that they've had with the company, as well as if they're like, say, a credit card company, what kind of money do they spend with us every year, and that sort of thing. And you can say that this customer is like very valuable to us, so give them sort of priority, attention and things. And that is all certainly possible. But on the other side, what we were sort of talking about before was that, companies know what is successful to them, because there's very limited set of reasons why someone's going to pick up a phone and call you, or go out to your website and launch a chat with your live chat or with your chatbot. Every company has their set of products and has their set of issues that they deal with. And so they have these scenarios where they have well-defined success, and they have scenarios where they've seen failure over time. And so we can actually apply AI to help these companies coach their people, coach their contact center agents to have a greater chance of success with their customers when they call in, because we can even pre-vet them and say, hey, this person, called in the past about this issue, and this is a follow-up to that, and here's the resolution of what happened last time. Wow. And here's what we think you should do to help make sure that this is a successful, close of contract or whatever it is. And so, that data, it's there in contact centers. It's just a matter of surfacing it and getting it to the contact center agent real time when that call starts, so that they have the best chance of success, really.
That's a great point. I mean, timing is everything, and you want that call center agent to have whatever information you can possibly provide. But I love that line you gave, and I'll throw this over to Tom to comment on. The data is there. Like, you almost assuredly have a lot of data that is available. The question is, how can you quickly sort out what is needed at this moment in time and align that with a particular interaction? And the answer there has a lot to do with AI and letting these algorithms do their thing, letting them serve up recommendations based upon history, based upon what's worked in the past, whatever the case may be. It is important to make sure you have that connection run all the way through, right, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. But again, it's very high stakes. So real-time analysis is not easy. As Ian mentioned earlier, there's kind of this difference between batch processing and transaction processing. Batch is you do some reports and you come up with some conclusions and then you act on them. Right. That's not real time, That's how a lot of businesses operate. Real time is you're on a call with the customer and the data is being processed as you speak, as the customers are speaking, and you get these insights on the fly. And that will create the magical customer experiences if done right. or it can create the nightmare customer experiences if done wrong. So it's very binary when it comes to this. So again, you got to work those muscles and, be very confident that you can do real time. I've talked to, people at Uber that used to do AI at Uber, went on to do other things. And, one of the products that I talked to my friend created was how to deliver this real-time AI. And at Uber, that's how you get those magical experiences. It just knows things. It's just almost incredible. But to get to that point took a huge amount of engineering, focus, and so forth. So it's not easy, but if you can do it, definitely, because it'll set you apart.
Yeah, that's the key too, right? And I'll throw this back over to Ian. Companies are always looking to set themselves apart. And to do that, I think you really have to focus on your strengths, especially these days, know what you're very good at. And AI can help you with that too, right? I'm excited about this comment you made about the data is in there. You have the data. You have tons of data. Many companies that have been around for 3 or more years have tons of data. Certainly, companies focused on retail or anything that is consumer facing, you're going to have mountains of data, of clickstream data, of interaction data through chatbot, through emails, whatever the case may be. That is a corpus of data with a lot of interesting information in there. The key is to be able to start mining that and better understanding what's going on. But you can learn so much just by looking at what you already have and then apply that to your current scenario and what you're trying to improve, right, Ian?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple ways you can do this to minimize your risk too. Is you can start out by doing sort of almost the offline sort of processing of this data to figure out, what are the scenarios that are working well for you as a company and as a customer service department or agency, and how do you define success, and then go back through that, haystack of data and say, okay, of all these things that we saw that we would consider to be successful, what were the attributes that led to that success? And then from that, you can start picking out features that you can start developing models for to say, tell me when we are traveling down the road to success, or if this feature is not present or not being met, or how can we get this conversation back on track? And then you can use those models to help these customer service agents make sure that those conversations are going the way you want. But that's all happening behind the scenes to the customers. The customer's not seeing that this is happening. You're sort of giving these suggestions to the customer service agent. So your risks are much lower because you're not, if you mess up, if you give a bad suggestion, the customer service agent can still, in a sense, override these suggestions by just ignoring them. Or even providing feedback, so you can collect feedback even from the customer service agents and say, like, that was a bad suggestion, I'm never going to do that, or whatever. And so you can almost try out these models on your internal employees, or, if you're outsourcing this stuff on the contact centers, before you would ever put them in front of your customer directly. And so it's almost a way to sort of make sure that your predictions are right and your suggestions are right before you go to a full-on virtual assistant or something that's going to just straight up interact with your customers directly without a filter.
Right. That's a great point. And maybe, Tom, I'll bring it back in. So for a chatbot that you deploy, for example, first just allow it to do the basic things, ask a couple of questions, answer things like address, hours, phone number, the stuff like that that's real easy to tackle. And then just make sure that it's in production and it's working in production. Then you add in another question. And you see this all the time. You get the chatbot will say, hey, are you here just browsing, looking to buy, something like that? I mean, you can shepherd the conversation however you want. And, that's the kind of thing for someone who enjoys doing that. That's kind of like a sandbox. It's almost like a playground of being able to kind of test market ideas and see what grabs interest, what doesn't grab interest. Does it work better when we give them suggestions? Does it work better when we don't give them suggestions? And I think you could even segment people into different groups who like suggestions versus don't like suggestions. I mean, there are lots of different things you can do to fine tune this stuff, but you do have to get started and start grabbing the information and assessing in real time how it's all working. Right, Tom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think Ian alluded to this, and that is, you may start the chatbot for internal purposes. So maybe for IT.
Right.
So what is the most common question people have for IT? And that is resetting the password. So it's pretty simple, but you can actually cut down on a lot of heartache for IT if you have a chatbot that can automate that whole process for you. So you can have a chatbot that just handles IT questions, or questions about vacation time or HR, all those kinds of internal things, and you're starting to interact with people and learning how these bots work and kind of what works and what doesn't. And so then once you build those muscles, then you go to the customer facing part of it for the chatbot. And then, like you said, you don't have to, the worst thing you could do is just do the big bang and just try to, boil the ocean. And usually you get boiled in the process.
Right.
Just come up with a few features, start with some specific, again, with the IT, just, we start with the password reset and you go from there. It could be for customer facing, it could just be the hours and just some basic stuff. Do that for a few weeks, see how that goes, and you just start adding and more, and then it just gets better and better and builds on itself. So it's a learning process. It's not just the AI that's learning; it's the people in the organization that are learning.
That's such a great way to put it, right? Because we learn together. And I was kind of hinting at that earlier. We need to learn from the machines as much as they need to learn from us. We do want to train these bots or other iterations of AI. You don't just have to do chatbots. There are lots of ways you can use AI under the covers and machine learning to do segmentation, classification, optimization. There's all kind of stuff you can do. But Ian, I love this idea of having something internally focused at first for your IT team, or even from your sales team, or whatever group you want, just to make sure it works internally before you face it to the customers, right? That's a brilliant strategy. What do you think, Ian?
Yeah, and getting back to even some of the things Tom was suggesting of doing some education, I think a lot of what we do as a company that provides virtual assistant for other companies is we educate them on what is a good idea and what is a bad idea. Because you'll get some company that comes to us and says, "Hey, we want to do this thing," and we're like, "Well, that's probably not a good idea to start there. Maybe you should scale it back and do this other thing, because your chances of success or even your ROI is going to be a lot higher." Because so many people want to, chase that long tail, the distribution, and say, let's get everything right. Everything that anybody calls in for, let's automate it. And then you say, well, you're going to spend so much money trying to do all of these things that don't occur very frequently, even if they are, very time consuming to handle. Why don't you focus on the things where you're going to get to see a really quick return on your investment? And so one of the things that we started doing as a company was we offer this almost a consulting services. We called it AI Blueprint, but we would go in and they don't even have to be a customer of ours. Just we would go in, we'd send like an analyst with a laptop, right? And they would go sit down at this customer's office and say, like, give us some examples of some of your customer contacts, like whether they're call transcripts or emails or whatever. And the analysts will sit down, they'll go through it and say, okay, they have a bunch of tools that we built to kind of help them do this quickly. But they would service like, okay, you're spending, 40% of your contacts handling this one issue. If all you did, you didn't do anything else. If all you did was automate this one issue, you'd see a huge return on your investment. And you don't have to do any of the rest of these things. You can just, punt on this stuff and just let your people handle it. And so educating them with their own data, right, that this is really where you should start is a big part, I think, of success, because then you're setting good expectations. They have basically something that they can hang their hat on and say, well, we had a success here. That's so now we're more likely to move forward with AI and automation because we had this one success.
What a good point. That's an excellent point. It really is. And because the key is you want to succeed and you want to then get better support from your organization, be able to demonstrate that success. And a lot of times it's kind of the elephant in the room that you didn't notice until someone else came in and pointed it out to you. But we'll pick that up after the break, folks. Don't touch that dial. You are listening to Inside Analysis.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks. Back here on Inside Analysis, talking all things AI and CX. What is the customer experience? Part of our new series, the CX Experience, all about customer experience technologies, methods, best practices, things you can do. And there are lots of questions around artificial intelligence. We've been talking to Tom Taulli, author, and Ian Beaver, a chief scientist over at Verint, about what to do with all these things. And there's this whole concept of governance and regulations and what can and cannot be governed. And if you get right down to it, AI, like you both have said, really amounts to another employee. So a chatbot out there is basically an employee interacting with your customers, with your prospects, and you have to treat that entity like a real person, like some part of your organization that should be governed. But how do you govern these things? And can they be regulated, right? I think there are lots of folks in governments around the world trying to figure that out. It's a pretty difficult thing to do, I would have to say, to come up with how you regulate AI. But Tom Taulli, I'll throw it over to you. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a fool's errand, or what do you think?
Regulation is always a lagging indicator. And governments usually operate slowly, but maybe a decade or two later they'll get to it. But by then the technology has gone in different directions. So we've come to a place now where it's more about self-regulation. IBM has, some bigger companies have put restrictions on themselves on how to use facial recognition. And I think a lot of it had to do with just the perception of using this technology, and it could be used in law enforcement, or it could be used in ways that may deny certain people's rights. Could land someone in prison, so these companies have to be careful, and so the larger companies are definitely under pressure to do things with this. But then you have a lot of other companies that don't really think about it. But I do think over time, what we will see, this usually a kind of the hallmark of the United States, is we have a lot of attorneys running around, and they like to sue companies for certain things, and if they feel like, this company did not provide credit to certain people based on this algorithm, which is biased. That companies could be on the hook. So it's definitely, something I think for the self-interest of these companies to think about, because I think over time there could be liability, and, maybe the next big cigarette, litigation, category could be an AI, 10 years from now.
That's a really good point. And, I have to say, I've thought about this before, but Ian, I'll throw it over to you. I think it's a kind of message that really has to get driven home to chief data officers, to chief technical officers, to CEOs, certainly to anyone in communications, but also operations, to really take this to heart and remember that this is an agent of your organization. So, and it's one that is going to be very prevalent because it's right there on the front lines, right? Anything that's on the front lines is going to affect your brand and how people perceive your brand and interact with your brand. So it's really important to take this very seriously and map it all out and understand the risks and understand what you're trying to achieve, and to frankly document that and have it be a pretty clear policy in your organization, right, Ian?
Yeah, and so while there's still no formal sort of guidance on ethical AI in industry as a whole, there is getting to be a pretty large, guidelines are surfacing, particularly around, even like within academic conference publication and things. So I sit on program committees for a lot of different AI conferences, reviewing papers and things, and they always give us sort of like an ethical punch list, in a sense, like make sure that they're considering these things in this paper, because we know that they have negative effects if they're not considered. And so you can learn from a lot of that as an organization, just looking at some of these sort of review guidelines they have for ethical use of AI. But there's up front, like product managers and product strategy folks, and as you're going through this R&D process, you really need to keep this stuff at the forefront. And there's some questions that you should be asking about anything involving machine learning or AI that just will save you so much pain down the road if they were at least thought through and documented, sort of at inception, or at least as you sort of more realize the potential. But there's questions that we ask ourselves when we initiate a new project, and we have a sort of a project planning template we go through, and some of these questions are on there, like what are the possible harms that exist
Right.
if this technology is being used as intended and is functioning correctly. Like, sort of like it's doing what it's supposed to do. Could it do harm? And another question is, what are the harms that exist if it's used as intended, but it's giving the wrong results? So if it predicts something incorrectly, sort of not maliciously, but it just came to the wrong conclusion, what could go wrong? Are we going to cause somebody to lose an account? Are we going to cause somebody to do something bad? And then the third is sort of the scenario everybody sort of worries about, but what are the harms that exist if there is misuse of the technology? So, you think about face recognition or self-driving cars or those things. What could go wrong if these things are misused? But then there's also that going back a ways to, I think you brought up Microsoft Tay earlier, but if a system is learning from user inputs or learning from its environment, what checks and limitations are we going to put into place on that learning to make sure that we can catch those things from going off the rails quickly and mitigate the damage as quick as possible? And if you have a set of questions like that, and there's other ones you can ask as well, that you just bake into your project templates. And so project managers, just like as part of their punch list, they go through this sort of ethical review and they say, okay, we want to incorporate machine learning or AI, and let's ask these questions and come up with the answers. At least, at the very least, you've thought about it.
Right.
And if something does go wrong, and regulation gets involved or you get sued or something like that, you can at least surface this documentation and say, look, we tried our best. We have, right. We have this audit trail to say that, we were trying to prevent the best of our knowledge, but this was some unforeseen circumstance or something.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I always think about that too, with respect to regulation and auditors and so forth. If you show that you had a thought process around it, you were trying to avoid that, that looks fantastic. I mean, that's going to save you, I think, most of the time when something goes wrong. And I think you make a really good point. And I'll throw this over to Tom. If you have these ethical conversations with your team, with your staff, with your partners, you're probably going to run across the edges that you should not breach. Let's say you're going to think at least through some of them, and then you're on the road to good governance, right? If you're an ethicist and you really think through the implications of your actions and how they could go wrong versus how they could go right, and I often joke about plans that go terribly right. You have to watch out for those too. But if you're on that path, at least you've got some guardrails and some protection. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, definitely. You need to have the checklist and the questions. But this is a lot of this is new to companies and uncharted territory, and even the biggest companies have problems. These issues can get tricky, and I think there's a lot of areas in that middle where it's not intentional. It's just they're trying to do the right thing, but it still has bad results. Right. And these models can get really complicated. And I think an example of this is Apple Pay. And it's a couple of years ago when it launched, and it had this it would use AI to create these credit limits. And quickly, all of a sudden on Twitter, people started saying, my wife has a much lower credit rating than me. And Wozniak even said that. Wozniak said, my wife actually makes more money than I make. And and then people would call Apple, and then the customer service people would say, well, it was just the algorithms, which is like the worst thing you could ever say when you have a problem with your AI and a credit limit, and it seems to have a gender issue here.
Right.
So now they fixed it, but what they found is that and Goldman Sachs was the partner to do this. These are top-notch companies, top-notch data scientists, and they did not ask or include gender as data. But they used certain data that reflected gender.
Interesting.
And produced results that could skew in certain ways. So, earlier in this conversation, remember I talked about data? It's not the exciting part. It's really boring. It's complicated. It's tedious. You got to clean it. You got to wrangle it. You got to do all these things. And that data, if you just don't, it can trick you in so many ways. And so you just have to have a really good understanding of that data. And I think that helps a lot when it comes to working with these issues on ethics and so forth.
Yeah, you remind me, I'm a cliche guy, so I'm always thinking of cliches, and one that just popped in my head is a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. You got to watch out for that. You want to dive in and really understand these things. Well, folks have been talking to these experts. You've been listening to the CX Experience.